If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is just the thing that you needed to hear right now. Because sometimes what's hidden beneath our feet reveals more about us than what we see in daylight. When you walk through an ancient forest, a medieval town, or a field seemingly empty in Europe, have you ever felt that strange impression that something there holds a memory that is not just of the earth, but of the soul? As if there was an echo silent, a deep breath coming from a past that still pulses? It's in this interval between the visible and the forgotten that our journey begins. Imagine an entire continent supported by 9,400 kilometers of mysterious tunnels, dug long before kingdoms, religions, or borders. Tunnels so old they seem challenge the very notion of time. Tunnels that unite countries that today speak languages different, but that one day, perhaps they shared a single fear or a single purpose. Why would someone create such long, narrow, and perfect underground paths? To run away? To protect? To keep secrets? Or to remember something we've forgotten? Science tries to explain, but hesitates. Archaeology measures, catalogs, records, but stumbles where human intuition knows territory. And spirituality recognizes these corridors as symbolic portals. Portals inward and downward. Portals for internal regions where we keep memories that don't fit in history books. There are those who say that these tunnels were only made as escape routes. Others believe which were sanctuaries. Some archaeologists claim that they were just utilitarian passages. But what if this is all just the surface? What if the true meaning is hidden like a subtle flame behind centuries of silence? Porque às vezes o subterrâneo não fala, ele sussurra. It doesn't show, it insinuates. And when we open our spiritual eyes to this whisper, we realize that perhaps the ancients did not. They were just excavating the earth. They were excavating their own consciousness. Today you will come down with me, not to a stone tunnel, but to a stone tunnel. Understanding what was found down there in the most recent excavations is not just archaeology. It's ancestral memory. It's deep psychology. It's spirituality condensed into rock. But before we go any further, I leave you with a question. What does the earth beneath us know about humanity? That we ourselves, have we forgotten? When the first maps began to be reconstructed, few believed that that could be real. Under French vineyards, German farms, Austrian hills, and Scottish woodlands, archaeologists found entrances so inconspicuous they appeared to be mere holes left by old roots. But as they followed these narrow corridors, they realized something unimaginable. They didn't finish. They turned, went down, connected. And the further they continued, the more the underground seemed to reveal a lost intelligence. No, they were natural caves. They were not random formations. They were tunnels made by hands human, disciplined, precise, persistent hands. And as the measurement progressed, the research teams began to realize that they were facing something that went beyond any known historical record. The first revelation came as a shock. There were interconnected tunnels that ran through entire regions, connecting cities that, officially, should not even exist in the same season. Archaeologists estimated that the network exceeded 9,400 kilometers, a feat of engineering that neither Romans nor Greeks nor medieval people were able to replicate with such continuity. Europe, once seen as a fragmented mosaic of tribes, now it emerged as a unified underground, perhaps planned, perhaps inherited. And this possibility overturned certainties that seemed untouchable. After all, who would have the ability, the time, and motivation to excavate something so vast in such remote eras? And more, why hide all this effort underground? Was it a work of fear or wisdom, from escape or preservation? As studies advanced, the second revelation emerged in the form of a symbol. The tunnels were oddly proportioned, too narrow for commerce, too long for serve only as shelters, too precise to be improvised. In many entrances, researchers found small circular chambers, true breathers of the earth as they called it, which seemed to serve not only ventilation, but perhaps to rituals. These circular environments had perfect acoustics, as if designed for kipi, the human voice echoing in a spiral. This intrigued anthropologists and psychologists who began to interpret tunnels not as escape routes, but as instruments of emotional transformation, where physical descents corresponded to internal descents. It would be It is possible that these corridors were part of initiatory rituals designed to prepare the mind, as certain cultures did with sacred caves. The engineering were esia to talk with spirituality, as if each excavated meter was also a metaphor for self-discovery. But it was at the intersection between science and intuition that the third revelation began to take hold: shape. Geological experts observed that many tunnels passed directly under underground fault lines considered energetically active. Ancient cultures believed that certain points on the earth carried special vibrations, lines where the sky and soil met invisibly. Today we call these ley lines, but for ancient peoples, these routes were symbolic portals to spiritual rebirth. No, there are documents that prove this intention, but it is difficult to ignore the pattern. Tunnels following energetic lines, circular chambers at intersection points, deep silence functioning as a psychological catalyst. Even skeptical archaeologists admit that the choice was not random. And here a fascinating paradox arises. To build something so extensive, a highly practical culture would be required. But to choose places so specific, a deeply symbolic people would be needed. Who could unite these two natures? And then the question that has echoed among historians arises. As a fragmented continent, formed by distant tribes and without written communication, could have planned something so cohesive? The most obvious answer would be, they didn't plan. But this answer leaves room for another, even more uncomfortable. Perhaps these people inherited the tunnels instead of create them. Maybe they just expanded existing structures. If this is true, then we are facing not a continental project, but a continental memory, remains of a previous civilization, forgotten, nameless, but endowed with a surprisingly refined organization. A civilization whose greatest legacy remained beneath the surface, silent and undisturbed, as wars, empires, and borders shifted in the distance. Landscape, above. The emotional synthesis of this discovery is inevitable. What lies beneath Europe is not just earth, stone, and history, it's identity. It's as if these tunnels were a mirror, dark that, when touched, reflects something that humanity has tried to remember for millennia: our shared fears, our protective instincts, our cycles of falling and rebirth. Maybe the tunnels weren't just made to store people, but to keep memories. And every meter excavated is a testimony that even in more primitive times, human beings were already searching for meaning, security, and transcendence. But before we move on to the next revelation, here's a silent invitation. What if these tunnels aren't just physical paths, but emotional maps left by a people who knew something that we still don't understand? As the researchers advanced through the narrow galleries, a question began to take shape with more force than any technical measurement. Who were the people capable of creating something like this? For decades, it was believed that Europe's prehistoric era was composed only of small, scattered tribes dedicated to hunting, rudimentary agriculture, and simple rituals. But the tunnels told another story, a history of coordination, purpose, and persistence that did not match the image that traditional archaeology built from these people. It was as if suddenly, a curtain opened and revealed a much more conscious, organized, and symbolic Europe than we imagined. And each hidden entrance reinforced the feeling that these ancient builders were not just survivors, they were narrators of the land itself. When they analyzed the sediments found on the walls, they discovered something even more surprising. Many of the tunnels dated back to periods so remote that they preceded the formation of permanent villages. This meant that nomadic populations, officially considered incapable of major works, they had created structures that required intergenerational collaboration. It wasn't just physical work. It was a cultural pact, one tradition transmitted not by writing, but by memory. Archaeologists began to realize that these people possessed a kind of intuitive engineering, where technical knowledge and spirituality went hand in hand, as if every blow of tool not only served to shape the stone, but also to shape the soul. After all, who digs kilometers of tunnels without seeing the end result? Just someone who works for the collective, not for the individual. But the biggest revelation didn't come from the walls. It came from the tools. Were found impossibly uniform marks, indicating the use of techniques that do not mesh well with the instruments known at the time. This gave rise to a bold hypothesis. Perhaps these people had access to forms of organization and transmission of knowledge much more advanced than we imagine. This is not lost technology in the sense literal, but of a human ability of precision and repetition that today, distracted perhaps as we have forgotten, this perspective paved the way for a new interpretation spiritual. What if these societies saw the act of digging as a sacred gesture, as a collective rite of a passage that strengthened not only survival, but identity of the entire group? It's fascinating to imagine that for them, the underground could be a temple horizontal, and this is where an essential detail ignored for decades emerges. Ancient Europe had deep fears of invasions, climate phenomena, ice ages, forces of nature that shaped human destiny. Tunnels could be an answer to this, an architecture of the survival instinct, but they could also be an emotional response, a way of dealing with the fragility of life, creating a path safe when the world above became unstable. At various points in the tunnels, found niches that resemble simple altars, as if people needed reaffirm their faith as they descended. Science calls them utilitarian structures. The soul recognizes as spaces of silence, and sometimes it is in silence that the oldest truth reveals itself. It is at this point in the study that many researchers confess a curious feeling, almost spiritual. They say that walking through these tunnels causes a kind of ancestral memory, as if something inside us recognized the experience of walking in narrow, deep, and dark places. Maybe because, at some point in history, human survival truly depended on the underground. Maybe because our psyche and deep layers still carry the memory of when the world outside was too dangerous. Or maybe because these tunnels are not just the work of people forgotten, but symbolic reflections of an interior process, descending to understand, ascending to be reborn. If you feel something awakening while listening to this, stay until the end. The answer may be here. The most recent and boldest interpretation proposes that these tunnels were not just physical paths, but paths of cultural connection between people separated by distance, climate, and language, a kind of underground unification on a continent that, on the surface, seemed fragmented. This changes everything. Means ancient Europe may have been more integrated, spiritually, than politically. A civilization without a name, without a flag, but with the same intention, to protect oneself, to communicate, to remember. This resonates deeply with the idea that ancient cultures had an instinctive wisdom about cycles of destruction and rebirth. Wisdom that today we try to decipher only through logic, forgetting that logic is not the only language of the past. And at the center of this hypothesis arises a final question, as beautiful as it is disturbing. These people dug the earth because they feared the world, or because they understood the world. World better than us? If they dug out of fear, they found protection. See, they dug for wisdom, they found transcendence. Maybe both things are true, and maybe that's why these tunnels keep calling us, as if they were the voice of an ancient Europe whispering something we still can't translate completely. And so I leave you with the question that opens the next portal. What if these people weren't just running away from danger, but preparing for something they knew would return? It was only when research teams began mapping the tunnels in 3 dimensions that a new astonishment took over the experts. Geometric precision. The galleries followed constant slopes, gentle curves, alignments that seemed respond to an invisible pattern. There was no irregularity, no crude improvisation. No, there was the chaos expected of Paleolithic excavations. On the contrary, each corridor seemed guided by a mathematical intention. This raised a perplexing question. How people considered pre-technical managed to maintain such a consistent standard without modern instruments. The most honest response from scientists was the most humble possible. We don't know, and it is precisely in the interval between knowing and not knowing that the mystery breathes. When they analyzed the composition of the walls, they found tool marks, surprisingly uniform, as if each group of diggers had received detailed instructions on the angle and force to be applied. This contrasts violently with what archaeology assumed about societies at the time. Small groups isolated, each with its own methods, without continental coordination. But the tunnel engineering showed another reality, a synchrony that crossed borders geographical and temporal. Some researchers have begun to propose that tunnels functioned as cultural transmission lines, where techniques and rituals were shared as a common legacy. Others, however, dared to suggest that perhaps we were faced with remnants of a wisdom that precedes even these peoples. Not in the fantastic sense, but in the psychological sense, a past knowledge forward through the deep memory of the species, like the intuition that we all carry with us, light a flame or seek shelter when the sky darkens. Most intriguing, however, was the discovery of chambers whose design resembled structures' advanced acoustics. At certain points, the human voice produces a triple echo. In others, the sound it simply disappears, absorbed by the stone as if there was an intention to create silence absolute. This aroused the interest of experts in historical acoustics, who realized that such effects were not accidental. Perfect silence for ancient cultures had weight spiritual. It was the door to introspection, the place where the human met the eternal. As explorers walked through these stretches, they reported sensations physical, racing heart, goosebumps on the skin, altered perception of time. The science explains it as a sensorial effect. The soul recognizes it as an encounter, thus an even deeper hypothesis. These tunnels may have functioned as instruments psychological, created to induce specific states of consciousness. Wouldn't it be the first time? Ancient people used sounds, songs, and closed environments as tools to access different levels of the mind, and perhaps the spirit. But the most fascinating element was in the inscriptions, or rather the lack thereof. It is almost impossible to find symbolic markings on the tunnel walls, which is strange for cultures that typically recorded rituals and beliefs in visual form. This absence deliberate suggests a type of knowledge transmitted orally, reserved only for those initiated, a knowledge that should not be fixed in stone, but rather in the body and memory. This has led some anthropologists to propose that the tunnels were part of an initiatory process. To descend was to abandon the surface of the ego. To cross was to face the unknown. Rise again, it was reborn. A physical metaphor for the inner journey, so present in spiritual traditions from around the world. In some ways, prehistoric Europe may have their own paths of descent, long before talking about shamanism or mysticism. Still, no element has generated more debate than the inconsistencies technological. There were sections where the wear and tear on the walls seemed to indicate the use of tools that do not align with the metallurgical capacity attributed to the people of season. Conservative researchers say these are misinterpretations. Progressive researchers say we are looking at lost techniques. And one small group, more daring, says something even more uncomfortable. Maybe we don't have fully understood what technology meant to these societies. Today we define technology as machines, metals, precise systems. But what if, for them, technology was also symbolic, communal, spiritual knowledge, and engineering, emotion so powerful that it allowed collective precision without instruments? Maybe what was lost was not the tool, but the spirit that guided the tool. The synthesis of this revelation is simple, but profound. The tunnels combine technique and transcendence. They are physical and psychological works at the same time. They are not just underground corridors. These are internal routes. Each meter expresses a question that has echoed in the human heart since the beginning of time. How to cross the darkness without losing the light. And there, in the deep silence, archaeologists and spiritualists agree on the first time. These people had an intimate relationship with mystery. They were not afraid of him, walked inside it. And so, I leave you with the next portal open. And if these tunnels not only bear witness to what the ancients built, but what did they feel? When research expanded beyond Central Europe, archaeologists began to notice something even more intriguing. The European tunnels were not a case isolated. In different parts of the world, in Asia, South America, and even the East Middle, there were underground structures that, although culturally distinct, carried surprising similarities in depth, intention, and complexity. It was as if civilizations separated by oceans, eras, and languages had received the same impulse: descend, excavate, hide, preserve. At first, this correlation seemed only archaeological coincidence, but as patterns repeated themselves, a bold idea began to emerge. Perhaps they were not isolated structures, but fragments of a global map of human memory, a map that we follow not with our feet, but with our soul. The first major comparison came with the underground cities of Cappadocia, in Turkey, where thousands of people survived in precisely excavated environments almost inexplicable. There, as in the European tunnels, Engineering seemed to surpass necessity. Corridors too narrow for commerce, chambers with ventilation impeccable, passages that stretched for kilometers. They were not improvised refugees. They were complex spatial systems, created with ritualistic patience ethics. A few continents away in Peru, the Chavin de Huantar tunnels showed the same principle of transformative descent, where the underground was used to alter the human perception. And when comparing these locations, a question emerged strongly silent. How people who have never met created structures that talk so deeply between each other? The traditional explanation is that human beings in times of danger tend to hide under the earth. It is coherent, practical, logical, but it does not explain the recurring symbolism, the descent ritual, acoustic silence, precise geometry, the absence of explicit records. Neither explains why so many cultures associated the underground with wisdom, rebirth, ancestral spirit. For some anthropologists, the answer lies in the psyche. The underground activates universal archetypes of protection and introspection, giving rise to similar patterns in different places. For others, the underground is simply the first temple that the human recognized, a mineral womb where life is reborn. However, the more tunnels were discovered, the more difficult it was to ignore the hypothesis of a common influence, even that this influence was not material, but symbolic, a collective intuition that crossed continents. When the focus returned to Europe, new evidence began to suggest that the tunnels were limited to the domain of engineering, but also to that of spirituality. In regions where pre-Celtic people lived, alignments between tunnels, monuments, megalithic monuments, and specific astronomical points, such as solstices and equinoxes, underground engineering seemed to dialogue with the sky, as if the journey downwards were a preparation to understand the above. This paradox, so common in ancient mysticism, reinforced the idea that tunnels not only had a practical function, but also symbolic. What if each tunnel was a return path, a link between matter and the sacred? This placed these people on a spiritual level that was rarely we recognize. They were not just survivors, but guardians of a cosmology deep. The connection between Europe and America became even more intriguing when they remembered native traditions that speak of people emerging from within the earth. For those Hopi, humanity came from underground worlds. For the Navajo, portals connected layers of existence. For ancient Andeans, caves were symbols of rebirth. Although separated by oceans and millennia, these people shared the same metaphor: the earth as a womb, the underground as an initiatory passage. It is necessary to interpret this literally to perceive the spiritual echo. Maybe these people were all responding to something we feel to this day, the need to rediscover, in the depths, what we lost on the surface. And when these myths are aligned with the archaeological evidence, the suspicion is born that the underground is not just a physical place, but a psychological mirror of humanity. Europe, in this context, stops being just a continent and becomes a part of a bigger puzzle. Its underground galleries were perhaps not isolated, but part of a global network of intuitive wisdom. Not a physical network, not tunnels of thousands of kilometers crossing oceans, but a spiritual network, distinct peoples responding to the same inner call. The engineering could even vary, but the intention it was the same: preserve, protect, transform. This is why so many experts, modernists, argue that we need to abandon the idea of isolated civilizations and understand humanity as an organism that, in different places, reacts to the same pressures existential. The synthesis of this revelation is gentle and profound. European tunnels not only speak about Europe, talk about the universal human being. They draw attention to a truth that we may have forgotten. When the world changes, the human instinct is to seek depth, whether in the earth or in oneself. We come down to remember who we are. We rise to express what we have learned. Each gallery, each excavated corridor, each planned silence is a portrait of this, the eternal desire to survive, but also to understand. And so I leave you with the question that opens the next layer. What if the underground is the last place where humanity kept what was not? Did you have the courage to lose? As researchers delved deeper into their journey through the layers of the subsoil European, realized that tunnels were not just physical artifacts, they were reflections accurate of what exists within us. The underground has always been the most ancient part of the human psyche. Our fears, our memories, and our instincts live there, more essential. And when archaeologists describe the sensation of walking through these long and silent corridors, many say something similar. It's like walking inside an ancient mind. This phrase, poetic at first sight, became a real hypothesis among evolutionary psychology researchers. Perhaps the tunnels are architectural expressions of collective unconscious, built at a time when humanity was still guided more instinct rather than analytical reason. Each dig doesn't just reveal one fact archaeological, but an emotional portrait of our ancestors. The first deep connection comes when we understand that fear has always been a great sculptor of civilizations. When climate change, predators, wars, or natural catastrophes threatened life on the surface, the underground became a shelter, but not just any shelter, a long-scale molded shelter, as if built not by momentary need, but by a silent wisdom that said, "Get ready because everything returns in cycles." This aligns with how ancient mythologies described humanity, beings that survived by descending into the earth before resurfacing transformed. Modern psychologists recognize this gesture as a pattern of ancestral behavior, the impulse to withdraw, to search for silence, to immerse in the shadows to reorganize the spirit before returning to the light. Tunnels, in this sense, are more than structures. They are petrified metaphors of human resilience. When symbolically analyzing these narrow paths, another essential element is perceived. The act of descending diminishes the ego. The surface is the domain of identity, competition, social construction. The underground is the territory of humility, surrender, vulnerability. Maybe that's why so many cultures associated caves with rituals of rebirth. The descent is the beginning of healing. Deep silence is dialogue with what is not we managed to name. And when we rise again, we are reborn, not as someone different, but as someone more conscious. This is why many archaeologists report who, even after hours of technical work, leave these tunnels feeling emotionally different, as if something in them had been rearranged. Science explains in terms of sensory perception. Spirituality recognizes it as internal polishing. The most fascinating thing is to realize that this ancestral relationship with the underground is still alive today. When modern life becomes too burdensome, we naturally seek out environments silent, closed, intimate, be it a dark room, a spiritual retreat, or a simple pause with your eyes closed. We return to the inner tunnel without even realizing it. It's the same biological memory, the same ancient code that guided our ancestors to excavate the land, because in essence, we continue to be beings who descend to understand and rise to re-exist. While archaeology tries to measure the depth of the tunnels, we try to measure the depth of ourselves. And the more we study these ancient structures, the more we realize that they are not just signs of the past, they are mirrors of the present. There is also the hypothesis that the tunnels were a way of preserving not only bodies but knowledge. In times of uncertainty, ancient cultures knew that their ideas could disappear. Thus, they kept objects, rituals, and symbols in hidden places, protected from the chaos of the surface. Today we do the same, but with other tools. We store data, memories, records. However, the essence remains identical, protecting what cannot be lost. The tunnels, therefore, are testimonies of what humanity fears and values most, losing its inner history. And when observing this spiritual concern expressed in stone, we realize that these ancient people were less naive than we suppose. They understood that the true continuity of existence depends not only on surviving the outside world, but on preserving the soul collective. When you put it all together, the precise engineering, the deep symbolism, the intuitive psychological, and the need for emotional survival, we understand that the tunnels reveal something that transcends time. Humanity is a species that digs for feel, not just to protect yourself. Every runner is a question, each descent, a delivery, each return to the surface, a recognition. Tunnels are not just heirlooms archaeological, but metaphors for the spiritual journey we have been on since we existed. And so, I leave you with the last portal before closing. What if what the tunnels protect is not just history, but memory depth of who we were meant to be. There is a moment at the end of any deep descent when we realize that what we were looking for underground was never really there. It was always inside us. When archaeologists reach the end of a European tunnel, they often find only silence, stone, and darkness. But it is precisely in this void that meaning reveals itself, because the underground does not speak through objects. He speaks through what he awakens. And if we look at these 9,400 kilometers of hidden corridors, we realize that each meter brings us closer to an essential truth. Humanity has never dug to escape, digged to remember. The UNAs are not witnesses of a lost civilization, but of an inner state that we still know. The ancestral need to preserve the soul when the world becomes too uncertain. And perhaps that's why they span so many regions and so many centuries, because each generation felt in some way that there was something too precious to be left on the surface, something that needed to be kept in the dark to bloom again in the light, like dormant seeds in deep winters waiting for the exact moment to be reborn. And as we slowly return to the surface, we leave behind not only stone and silence, but also the layers of ourselves that needed to be peeled back. Earth is a kind teacher. It does not require haste, it does not require immediate responses. It just offers depth. And as we cross these paths dug by hands that are no longer here, we realize that we too are made of layers, some fragile, others ancient, others still unknown. It is at this point in the journey that a soft, almost imperceptible realization dawns. The ancients perhaps sought not just to survive, but to remember who they were, remembering what they knew, remembering what they feared, and what they loved. Likewise, when today we study these tunnels, we are doing the same. We don't just want to explain the past. We want to understand what he still whispers to our spirit. There are discoveries that reveal facts. There are others that reveal people. And some, like this, reveals the human soul itself. So when you close your eyes for a moment, you may notice something familiar, one feeling that you have been silent before. You've walked through internal corridors. Already he carried memories he couldn't name. The underground we explore in this story is just a reflection of the underground that exists within each of us. A place of collection, listening, rebirth. A place where time stops being chronological and becomes emotional. And now, as we emerge together, a thought forms with the softness of an ancient memory. Perhaps what archaeology calls a tunnel, spirituality calls path. Maybe what we call darkness is just the space where light comes in, rearranges before returning. Perhaps what we call a mystery is just what we still haven't had the courage to understand. If this journey has touched something inside you, sign up and follow along with us. Your soul can be remembering the path. And I leave you with the last question, the one that remains even when everything else falls apart. Shut up. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a return that the soul will never stop doing it?